I am guaranteeing you that Adam Silver and the other WNBA owners will emerge victorious from this negotiation because the WNBPA, the Players Association, is an outright mess.
Right now, one of the most intense battles in professional sports isn't happening on the court. It's happening behind closed doors. The Women's National Basketball Players Association and league ownership are locked in negotiations that could reshape the future of the entire WNBA. On the surface, it looks like a typical labor dispute. Players asking for a bigger share of revenue, owners trying to protect the league's long-term finances. But behind the headlines, the situation appears far more complicated. Over the past year, the WNBA has experienced something it has been chasing for decades: massive growth. Television ratings are rising, arenas are filling up, and the league recently secured a multi-billion-dollar media rights deal that signals a completely new level of financial interest in women's basketball. Much of that surge in attention has followed the arrival of players like Caitlin Clark, whose games have drawn record viewership and brought millions of new fans into the sport. In theory, this should be the perfect moment for players to push for stronger contracts and better revenue sharing. But negotiations in professional sports rarely follow a simple script. Instead, they often turn into high-stakes strategy games where timing, leverage, and internal unity matter just as much as the actual numbers being discussed. One wrong move, one leak, one internal disagreement, one public misstep can dramatically shift the balance of power. And that's exactly why the current negotiations have attracted so much attention. Some analysts believe the players' union still holds strong leverage because of the league's recent surge in popularity. Others argue that ownership groups have quietly positioned themselves to control the outcome of the talks. Either way, the stakes couldn't be higher. Because the agreement that comes out of these negotiations won't just affect salaries or contract terms, it could shape the financial structure of the league for years to come. And according to some observers, the strategy behind this negotiation may have started with one carefully timed move. When people talk about the business side of basketball, one name almost always comes up: Adam Silver. Silver has built a reputation as one of the most calculated executives in professional sports. Unlike the old-school commissioners who relied on aggressive public battles, Silver is known for a much quieter approach. He studies leverage, timing, and psychology. In high-stakes negotiations, those factors can matter just as much as money. And right now, many analysts believe that approach is playing a major role in the ongoing discussions between the league and the Women's National Basketball Players Association. Here's why. In labor negotiations, the side that controls urgency often controls the outcome. Owners understand that players rely on contracts, game checks, and season schedules to make their living. Even a small delay in negotiations can create uncertainty about training camp, free agency, and upcoming salaries. That uncertainty can quickly turn into pressure. Some analysts argue that league leadership understands this dynamic extremely well. Instead of responding emotionally to public criticism or social media campaigns, executives often focus on controlling the timeline of negotiations. When a negotiation suddenly has a looming deadline, the conversation can shift from "what deal do we want?" to "how quickly do we need to make one?" And that shift changes everything. Because players across the league don't all share the same financial situation. Star athletes with endorsements and overseas opportunities might be able to wait out long negotiations, but many mid-tier players depend heavily on their WNBA contracts. For them, uncertainty can feel risky. That's why timing becomes such a powerful negotiating tool. If a league can introduce urgency, whether through scheduling announcements, contract timelines, or potential delays to the season, it can increase pressure on the players' side of the table. Of course, none of this guarantees victory for either side. Labor negotiations in professional sports are complex, and both owners and players typically make concessions before a final agreement is reached. But what makes this situation particularly fascinating is the moment in which it's happening. The WNBA is experiencing one of the biggest growth surges in its history. New fans are arriving, television deals are expanding, and stars like Caitlin Clark are drawing unprecedented attention to the sport. Which means both sides believe they have something valuable to protect. And that's exactly what makes the next stage of this negotiation so unpredictable. In high-stakes negotiations, one of the most powerful tools isn't money, it's time. And according to several analysts, the moment the conversation around a potential negotiation deadline surfaced, the entire tone of the WNBA labor talks began to shift. When league leadership discussed the possibility of needing an agreement by a certain point in the calendar, the message immediately sent a signal across the league. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't just about revenue percentages or long-term growth anymore. It was about what could happen if the clock kept ticking without a deal. That's when pressure starts to build. Deadlines in sports negotiations often create urgency because the entire ecosystem of the league depends on the calendar moving forward. Training camps have to start, free agents need contracts, teams need to prepare for the season, and players, especially those without large endorsement deals, depend on those game checks. Once the idea of a negotiation timeline enters the conversation, uncertainty spreads quickly. Players begin asking questions, agents start calling executives, front offices begin preparing contingency plans in case talks stall longer than expected. Even fans start wondering whether the upcoming season could be affected. And that's exactly why analysts like David Sampson often point out that deadlines can become strategic tools in labor disputes. When one side feels the clock ticking louder than the other, the psychological balance of the negotiation can shift dramatically. The conversation moves away from ideal demands and toward practical outcomes. In other words, the question changes from "what deal do we want?" to "what deal can we realistically finalize before time runs out?" That shift alone can alter the dynamic of an entire negotiation. Of course, deadlines in sports labor talks are often more flexible than they appear. Leagues and unions frequently continue discussions long after early timelines are mentioned publicly. In many cases, agreements are reached at the very last moment. But even if the deadline itself isn't absolute, the pressure it creates is very real. And once that pressure enters the picture, every internal disagreement, every leaked detail, and every public statement suddenly carries much more weight. Because when the clock appears to be ticking, even small cracks inside an organization can start to widen. And that's exactly what many observers believe happened next. But the real turning point in this entire situation may not have been the deadline. According to reports and commentary circulating around the league, the bigger problem may have come from inside the union itself. Labor negotiations rely heavily on one critical factor: unity. When a players' association sits down at the negotiating table, its strength comes from presenting a single, consistent message. Owners may disagree with that message, but as long as the players appear unified, the union maintains leverage. The moment that unity looks shaky, everything changes. And that's why the reports of internal disagreement inside the Women's National Basketball Players Association quickly became one of the most talked about aspects of the negotiations. Several media discussions referenced tensions involving members of the union's leadership, including players like Kelsey Plum and Breena Stewart. While details about internal conversations remain largely private, the suggestion that some players felt frustrated about communication within the union began circulating through sports media. And once that kind of story becomes public, the effects can spread fast. Players start hearing different versions of events. Agents begin asking questions about negotiation strategy. Analysts debate whether the union's leadership has full support from the locker rooms across the league. Even if the disagreements are relatively small, the perception of division can become a major factor. Because in professional sports negotiations, perception matters almost as much as reality. If ownership groups believe the players are completely united, they know the union can potentially hold firm for a long time. But if owners sense uncertainty or internal frustration among players, they may feel less pressure to compromise quickly. That's why analysts often describe leaks or public disagreements as some of the most dangerous moments for any union during negotiations. It doesn't necessarily mean the organization is collapsing, but it can signal that conversations behind closed doors are more complicated than they appear publicly. And in this particular negotiation, timing made the situation even more delicate. The WNBA is currently experiencing one of the most important growth moments in its history, fueled by new media deals and rising attention around stars like Caitlin Clark. Which means both sides know that whatever happens in these negotiations will shape the future of the league. And when that much money, visibility, and momentum are on the line, even small cracks inside an organization can suddenly become major storylines. In any high-stakes negotiation, information is power. And in sports labor battles, one rule has been repeated for decades: never let the other side see division inside your group. That's why analysts often say leaks can be one of the most damaging things that happen during negotiations between leagues and players' unions. When discussions remain private, both sides are forced to guess how unified the other group really is. Owners might suspect players are frustrated, but they can't prove it. Players might believe owners are under pressure, but they can't see the internal conversations happening inside boardrooms. That uncertainty keeps both sides cautious. But the moment internal disagreements become public, the entire negotiation dynamic can shift. If reports surface that players are frustrated with leadership, questioning strategy, or disagreeing about the direction of negotiations, ownership groups suddenly gain valuable insight into the union's internal situation. Even if the disagreements are relatively small, the perception of instability can influence how the other side approaches the next round of talks. That's why former sports executives like David Sampson frequently point out that unity is one of the most important assets a players' association has. When a union presents a completely united front, ownership groups understand that holding firm may lead to a long standoff. In that scenario, both sides usually search for compromise because neither wants negotiations to drag on indefinitely. But when leaks suggest internal frustration or confusion, owners may feel less urgency to make concessions. From a negotiating standpoint, they may believe the pressure inside the union will eventually push players toward accepting a deal. That doesn't mean leaks automatically decide the outcome of negotiations. Labor talks are complicated, and many factors, from revenue projections to media deals, play a role in the final agreement. Still, perception matters. And in this particular situation, the timing of these reports is especially important. The WNBA is currently experiencing one of the most significant growth periods in its history. New television contracts, rising attendance, and expanding fan interest have created a rare moment of momentum for the league. Much of that momentum has been tied to the surge in attention around stars like Caitlin Clark, which means both sides understand the stakes are enormous. Because if negotiations drag on too long, or if the perception of conflict grows, there's always a risk that the league's current momentum could start to slow. While negotiations and union tensions dominate the headlines, another factor is quietly shaping the entire landscape of the WNBA. And that factor has a name: Caitlin Clark. When Clark entered the league, she didn't just arrive as another rookie. She arrived with one of the biggest college basketball followings in recent memory. Her deep shooting range, fast-paced playmaking, and ability to create highlight moments turned her games into must-watch events long before she played a single professional minute. But what happened after she joined the WNBA surprised even many league insiders. Television ratings surged. Arenas began selling out in cities that had rarely seen full crowds before. Some teams even moved games to larger venues when Clark's team was coming to town, simply to accommodate the demand. That level of attention doesn't happen often in professional sports. And it didn't go unnoticed by television networks or corporate sponsors. Soon after Clark's rookie season began generating record viewership numbers, major media companies started paying much closer attention to the league's potential. The WNBA ultimately secured a media rights agreement reportedly worth more than $2 billion, a massive step forward compared to previous deals. For many analysts, the connection between Clark's arrival and the surge in interest was impossible to ignore. The effect wasn't limited to television ratings either. Merchandise sales increased, social media engagement exploded, and fans who had never followed the WNBA before suddenly started watching games, discussing players, and attending live events. In other words, Clark didn't just bring attention to her own team, she helped introduce the entire league to a new audience. That's why some commentators describe this moment as a turning point for women's basketball. For decades, the WNBA worked steadily to grow its fan base and build financial stability. But moments of rapid expansion like this can accelerate that process dramatically. When a single player attracts millions of new viewers, the ripple effects can impact sponsorship deals, broadcast contracts, and the overall value of the league. And that brings the story back to the current negotiations. Because while players and owners debate revenue percentages and future contracts, everyone involved understands one important reality: the league's momentum has never been stronger. The challenge now is making sure that momentum continues. And the decisions made during these negotiations could determine whether this surge in attention becomes a lasting transformation or just a brief moment in the league's long journey of growth. But here, the question that makes everyone in the league nervous: what happens if the deal doesn't get done? In professional sports, collective bargaining negotiations always carry the same risk. If both sides push too hard, the entire season can end up in jeopardy. History has shown this many times across different leagues. When negotiations stall long enough, the next step can become a lockout, a delayed season, or in extreme cases, games being cancelled altogether. For the WNBA, that possibility carries enormous consequences right now. The league is experiencing one of the biggest growth moments in its history. New expansion teams are on the way, television deals are getting larger, and stars like Caitlin Clark are bringing millions of new viewers into the sport. Momentum like that is incredibly valuable, but also incredibly fragile. If negotiations between league ownership and the Women's National Basketball Players Association were to break down completely, the impact wouldn't just affect players and owners. It would ripple across the entire ecosystem of the league. Players could lose game checks, teams could lose ticket revenue, networks that invested heavily in broadcasting rights could suddenly face empty time slots where games were supposed to air. And perhaps most importantly, fans who recently discovered the league might lose interest if the product disappears from television for an extended period of time. Sports history shows that once fans drift away, it can take years to bring them back. That's why both sides usually try to avoid the worst-case scenario. Even when negotiations become heated, leagues and players' associations typically keep talking behind the scenes. Deals are often reached at the last possible moment, sometimes only days or even hours before major deadlines. Neither side wants to be responsible for stopping the momentum of a growing sport. But the pressure remains real. Because the players are fighting for what they believe is a fair share of the league's growing revenue. At the same time, ownership groups are trying to protect the financial structure that allows the league to keep expanding. Those two goals don't always align perfectly, which means the next stage of negotiations could determine far more than just contract numbers. It could determine whether the WNBA's current surge of attention turns into a long-term golden era or a moment of momentum that slipped away at exactly the wrong time. So when you step back and look at everything that has happened, one thing becomes clear: the WNBA is standing at a crossroads. On one side is the biggest wave of attention the league has ever seen. New television deals are expanding the league's reach, arenas are filling up, and players are finally seeing the kind of visibility many of them fought years to achieve. The sport is growing faster than it has at any point in its history, and stars like Caitlin Clark have helped bring millions of new eyes to the game. But growth also brings pressure. Behind the scenes, negotiations between league leadership and the Women's National Basketball Players Association are shaping what the future of the league will look like. These conversations are about far more than just salary numbers. They touch on revenue sharing, travel standards, player benefits, and the overall structure of how the league operates moving forward. And when stakes get this high, tensions naturally rise. Players want a larger share of the growing financial pie. Owners want to protect the long-term stability of the league. Both sides believe they are fighting for the future of women's basketball, but they are approaching that future from different angles. That's why moments like this can become defining chapters in a league's history. If an agreement is reached that satisfies both sides, the WNBA could enter a new era of stability and growth. Higher visibility, better player conditions, and stronger business partnerships could push the sport to levels it has never reached before. But if negotiations collapse or drag on too long, the consequences could ripple through the entire ecosystem. Fans who recently discovered the league might drift away. Sponsors could hesitate, and the momentum that took years to build could suddenly stall. Sports history is filled with examples where labor disputes slowed the rise of a league, just as it was gaining traction. That's why the coming months matter so much. Because right now, the WNBA isn't just negotiating a contract, it's negotiating the direction of the entire sport. The decisions made in these talks will shape how the league grows, how players are compensated, and how fans experience the game for years to come. And depending on how it all unfolds, this moment could either be remembered as the beginning of the WNBA's golden era, or the turning point where the league faced its biggest test yet.